Okay, so before we begin, you have to imagine that Mary is sitting in her corner office, because she's very powerful. And I'm sticking my head in, alluringly, and saying, "You got a minute?"
Yes.
You sure?
I think so.
Okay, so there are two great, famous unsolved murders in Los Angeles. You know what they are.
I do.
Black Dahlia
Yeah.
and Bugsy Siegel. What if we solved one of them?
Okay, so at this point, I don't know if any of you watch House of Cards. We can call this our Frank Underwood moment, where he turns to the camera and he's like, "Okay, let me tell you how this works." Writers will come to you with all kinds of ideas. You hope that they come to you with all kinds of ideas. In fact, I won't hire anyone unless I know that they are an idea machine. It's not my job to come up with ideas, though I come up with a lot of ideas.
You do.
But you want to be able to rely on people who are always thinking about their job, their stories, the potential stories that they see. I've said before that if we put all of you, well, I haven't said this here, so actually I've never said this before here, but I've said this before in other contexts. If we put all of you on a bus right now, and city bus, and you got off 10 miles later, and there were 25 people on the bus, and you didn't come off of the bus with 25 ideas, you should probably think of another line of business. Because every single person on that bus has a story. Which is not to say that every single story is worth writing 10,000 words about. But great writers will come to you with great ideas. They'll also come to you with really, really bad ideas. And it's your job, right, as the editor, to try to help them through that encouragingly, and to also trust that this one's going to be the one that sells itself. So, okay, go.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to the third wall now and break it. So this woman is a history nut. She loves LA history. So on June 20th, 1947, 67 years ago when I was pitching, 68 now, Bugsy Siegel, who was one of the major Mafia kingpins, well known partly now because of Warren Beatty making a movie about him, but the father of modern Las Vegas, grew up in New York, was a major, brutal figure in mob circles, was sitting in his girlfriend's living room in Beverly Hills on the couch reading the newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, my former place of employ. That's the house on Linden Drive in Beverly Hills, which I happen to know that Mary had been past and maybe parked outside of several times.
More than once, yes.
Just to look at it. He was shot M1 carbine through a window. It had never been solved. It is one of the great unsolved cases in Los Angeles. And when I went into Mary's office, I said, "I've got a family that's come forward and told me they know who did it." It turns out that this 71-year-old realtor who had lived with this secret his whole life not only said he knew who had killed Bugsy Siegel, but that there was a twist. That always Bugsy Siegel has been said to have been killed by the mob because he spent too much of their money and was skimming money. He was killed because he was greedy and profligate, and he was too flashy, and he was dangerous, but he also just spent too much money, and they were in the business of making money. This man said to me that no, he was not killed for money, he was killed for love. And there he is dead. One more.
We won't stay on that one too long. You just
yeah, there's the floral couch where he was. And then he's in the morgue. Here I'm gonna, which way do I do it? This one? Okay. Robbie is this elderly gentleman is saying to me, my mother was the center of this whole plot. And her name was B. So
I wonder at this point, is B alive?
No.
Okay. So you're going to construct a story around a character who's dead.
Yes, but I have two bits of information. Besides Robbie's memory and the stories that he was told as a child, and a variety of members of his family who also heard these stories, all from the same, unfortunately, single source, B, I have two bits of information. I have a book proposal that B wrote but never took to market, so no one's ever read it, no one's ever said, and the book was never written. Those are my Post-it notes, my nerdy Post-it notes. And I also have a 2-hour interview with B from 1993, I think it was, that was done for a documentary called Loyalty or Betrayal, the mob story, that Nick Pileggi, who is actually quite famous for writing Casino and Goodfellas, I think, one of the Mafia experts, actually wrote the script for this documentary, and I had the raw footage, and I could look at all of it, and most of it did not appear in the piece. So we'll just play that. You get a sense of B.
If you remember when Ben died and what your reaction was.
Fear, for one. Heartbreak, for another.
Fear of what, B?
Do I have to talk about that?
No, if you don't want to.
No, because I still miss him.
Okay. Douglas, did you have anything else, B, that you would like to say?
No, Sid, I just hope some publisher publishes my book to hear the truth about these fellas.
Do you think movies have misrepresented these men?
A lot of it. And the newspapers. I know they weren't angels and things, but nobody ever bothers to write in a book the good things. Nobody.
Why do you think that
And
is?
when I die, who else is going to tell the truth? And that could be any day. You never know.
Okay, so I had a story that was centered on this woman who was dead, and everybody else who had primary knowledge of the crime was also dead. So that was what I was pitching my editor in the hopes that she would give me several months to work on it and deliver it.
And at that point, you have to think, okay, we've got a main character we want to draw this whole story around who's no longer here. And we do have source material for her. We've got a manuscript, we've got a lot of video footage, but a one-source story is pretty much a no-source story, right? You've probably read stories even in your classes of there's been a few notorious ones in the last few years of stories that have come out and they weren't fact-checked, or they had one person say this is what happened and that didn't actually happen. So I'm thinking, how's Amy going to build this story around this person? Is she going to be able to fan out and figure out who can corroborate the story? And we've heard a lot today about trust, right? You're trusting your writer as an editor to go out and be a great representative of the magazine, right? Like to be out in the world and to be fair and accurate in their reporting and truthful in their telling of everything, to be factually accurate. You know, you're trusting them to not misrepresent anyone or any events or any place or thing. You know, you're trusting them to not plagiarize anything, you know, to have it all be original material. And then they're trusting you in return to have their back and to guide them through this process. And you have to weigh, is this someone I trust to really be able to figure this out? And with this one, it was a little too intoxicating to think about saying no to this, because I knew Amy would take it probably some other place. First and foremost, but also because it just was such a quintessential LA story, and that's what we're always looking for in our magazine, is what are stories that really tell the story of LA, past, present, and future, and what are stories that are going to entertain our readers, what are stories that are going to really educate our readers and surprise them, because beyond everything, we've got to think about our readers. So ultimately, I'm thinking our readers are going to eat this story up, and I trust Amy to do this, so go down the rabbit hole and see what you find.
So I just want to reiterate something that several people have mentioned. Chris Jones said it explicitly. If you don't have the reporting, you don't have dick. I mean, you got nothing. You can be a stylist, and there are a lot of great writers who can write around it and hide it and sort of show off. And definitely in celebrity journalism, I've done it too. Sometimes you have to bring the conceit because the person that you're interviewing is not going to say anything to you. And I've had that. I haven't quite done it quite as boldly as Kristen, but I've definitely written many a celebrity profile that didn't have a lot of meat on the bone because the person wouldn't play ball. So that's somewhat of a different situation. But in a story like this, you first of all, we're trying to solve a mystery that may be unsolvable, and you have to go down every avenue. And that is also where the trust of your editor comes in, because you need an editor who's going to help you. You have to go down the rabbit hole, and you have to have somebody who's going to help you come back out of that rabbit hole when you're like, whoa, I've got too much going on. So I thought I would just sum up some of the few things that I did. Okay, so Bee's story was that Bee had been married to Mo Sedway. She was Mo's widow. Mo and Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo together. They were sent out to Vegas together to open it. And when Bugsy was killed, Mo took over the Flamingo. There were several people involved, but he was the money guy. He reported to Meyer Lansky about how much money was coming in every day, and he was the one who was a prime suspect in the murder because he took over after Bugsy, so he seemed to have incentive. So B's story was that Bugsy had made a threat on Moe's life before he was killed, and that Meyer Lansky had heard that Bugsy had said he wanted to have Moe killed, and Meyer Lansky decided that Bugsy needed to be killed, but that Bugsy needed to be killed by somebody who was not in the family. As it happened, B had a boyfriend who her husband Moe knew about, and his name, which is almost reason enough to do the story in the first place, was Moose. It was not actually Moose, but that was what he went by.
Had it been Elk, she would have never done it.
Yeah, if it was just Joe, my interest in the story would have gone down by a big margin. So Moose had according to B, Moose had volunteered. Moose was not Mafia. He was a Yugoslavian. He had been born in Los Angeles, but his parents were Yugoslavian immigrants. And he was huge. He was 6'3". She was under 5 feet, and Moe, her husband, this will become relevant in a moment, her husband was just 5'2". She told a whole story about how Moose did it and how Moose got away with it. Moose was never a suspect that she knew of, and this was how it had gone down. So there were several things I needed to do. One, if we were going to accuse the Panza family, his name is Moose Panza, of having killed somebody, we had to find Moose, and we had to find his family, because I knew Moose was dead by this point. So I had to track him down, and unfortunately, his real name is Matthew. Finding the birth certificate was a challenge, because it was not listed as Matthew. It was listed as Mike Jack Panza. So there was a whole record search that was involved. Then I started to search for family members, and I became a big Ancestry.com crazy heritage, blah, blah, blah. I still get these bills for $50 a year that I'm still paying. I signed up on 1 million sites and tracked down his brother, who I then figured out was dead, and et cetera, et cetera. Then I found, it seemed like his brother's kids, and then, oh God, they still lived in Southern California, woohoo! But who were they really, and were they his kids, or were they someone else's kids? I found phone numbers. Someone else mentioned this. Even when this is a story that was complicated because obviously there was a timeline, a chronological storytelling issue, but we were going to jump back and forth in time. There was me sitting down with Robbie, the son of Moe and B, in present day, but there was also this past story and how are we going to do it. The only way I can keep track of this stuff is to make these huge timelines that are on bulletin boards that have all these colored parts, and then I end up writing themes and things in the sidelines. So you have to have that, even if you're going to mess around with the chronology, especially if you're going to mess around with the chronology, you have to have that. So we had that going on.
And the timeline too, I'll just say one more thing about the importance for me as an editor for timelines with writers, is timelines also show you where there are gaps. So when you really, especially when you're doing anything that's biographical and you're plugging it in, and you'll see holes in things, and you'll wonder, well, where were they for these 5 years? And you find out, actually they had a horrible accident and they were incapacitated for a few years. And that could turn out to completely change the direction of wherever they took their lives. And suddenly you have information that you didn't have before. And this has come up a lot when you're doing a timeline. We do a lot of biographical profiles at the magazine. And it's really interesting when you fill in those holes of what is missing. Like, it's almost more about sometimes what's missing than what's there, but it's also the only way to really keep track of where you're at, because then when you remove them and start moving the parts of it around, you actually have the dates as a constant reminder on those
cards. And people won't tell you their whole story. They're not proud of parts of it, so they leave that part out. And you may stumble on something that you really are glad you didn't leave out because of that. So I read, every book I could find. Some famous, like the one on the right is a really famous, huge history of the mob. The one in the middle, no one had ever heard of, but I bought it anyway on Amazon.com. I was assembling anything that I could. There were 2 pivotal moments for me that were very exciting in trying to go down all these avenues. At one point I realized B had met Moe Sedway in New York City at a club called the Paradise. She was a 17-year-old dancer, And she didn't know this was a mob hangout, but it was. There was a special table where the mob guys sat that was kind of raised up in the audience that no one else could sit at. And these girls would come in, and Mo Sedway, who was, as I said, very tiny, was actually not there the first night that she danced, but one of his henchmen, Ice Pick Willie Alderman, I believe it was, spotted this teeny girl and was like, that one's for Mo right there. So he got in touch with him in Europe and said, there's a girl that you need to meet. And as I was writing this part of the story, I was like, I need to understand this club, like what did it look like? I mean, I have these words that are written in her book proposal, but what did it look like for her to be a dancer, and what did these clubs look like, and what did Broadway look like at the time? And I started just typing into, so classic, just Google search, nothing sophisticated. Paradise Club, Cabaret, New York City, and found this very weird photo archive that just some woman had made of her relatives' cool photos that he took while he was a dancer on Broadway, that he also was an amateur photographer. And I started scrolling through, and B popped up. Her own family had never seen these pictures. So, and I shared them with the family, and they were like, oh my God, that's her. And there were these kind of spine-tingly moments. The other moment happened late in the reporting, and if you read the story, the question of, we're going to get to the writing of it in a second, but with these kinds of stories, there's always a question of how much to put yourself in it. And you ideally leave yourself out of it and you just tell the story, but in this case, I was finding out information in a certain weird order, like you do, and that was affecting how the story was evolving. And so my search for all this information was actually one of the ways we told the story. And late in the story, I was talking to a 78-year-old. All my sources were ancient in the story. If I could find them, I was lucky enough that they were alive. They were old. She was the ex-wife of Robbie's brother, Dick, who was dead. So she was the ex-wife of one of B's other son. And as we were talking, I said, you know, I was just, sometimes you natter on as a reporter to try to get people comfortable. So I was just telling her, there's many things I've done. I really want to tell this so truthfully and so well and so clearly. Like, for example, I'm like trying to find Moose's family, and I don't think he had any kids, but I found it. And she goes, you don't think he had any kids? I was like, no. I mean, did he have any kids? Well, many of us believe that Robbie is Moose's son, not Mo's. Screech! Like, what? Like, I was already way down the road. Yeah. And then things started to size up. Robbie wasn't 6'3", but he was 5'10". He was 8 inches taller than either of his parents. And look at his hand next to Moose's. So this is Moose, this is B, this is Robbie on his wedding day. What? Like, so I then went and tried to find these pictures. I started to get people to send me pictures, because we didn't know what Robbie looked like. He was 71 at this point. He doesn't look exactly like Moose, but he certainly has some resemblance. Robbie at this point is dying of cancer, and I race, if you read the story, I race to his bedside basically to ask him about it, and he's too far gone. He's in hospice. He can't talk to me about Moose and whether he had any suspicions. But that became, luckily because of the way we decided to tell the story, where I'm an actor in the story, that we could kind of tell that part of it.
And all through this, Amy's, you know, when you let a writer go sometimes and they don't have other things they have to do, I always try to clear the decks for any of our editors when it's time for them to write a feature. So we redistribute what's their usual workload so that they can kind of go and be. And sometimes you feel like they really have fallen off of the grid because they're not appearing, or when they do appear, they look disheveled and, you know, generally like they haven't been sleeping and, or showering. You know, Kelly, I think, talked about the, you know, burrito in the middle of the night, like, what can I do to help you? Because they are emailing you at 2 and 3 in the morning, telling you, look at what I just found on a burlesque dance site.
This is so exciting.
Yeah, this is really exciting. Make me some more coffee. But the urgency of it suddenly became really apparent when you told me that he was really dying, like this was imminent.
Yeah.
And we suddenly had
Well, and I thought that I was done with my Robbie reporting at that point. I didn't think I needed to ask him anything else. And then suddenly I had this big thing I wanted to ask him, which was, did you think Moose was your father? What? Because Moose had later, after Mo died, married Robbie's mother and raised Robbie. And Robbie had said things to me, the quotes now made more sense, like, Moose taught me how to be a man, and Moose, took me hunting, and he taught me how to fist fight. You never let the guy up. And those kinds of great details like Ben was talking about that you can suddenly see that the relationship of these two people just by the little things, the little memories that they have. And I raced to him, and again, there was this sort of race against the clock, but also this feeling of like trying to examine history when history is about to slip out of your hand. Like it's almost gone. You almost can't check it. So there was that kind of theme in the story throughout it, as well as the narrative of the story. Now, we were just talking about this. We had a wonderful young person make this PowerPoint for us because we can't do this stuff, but we like to imply that we are multi-talented.
We're really happy that all of you can.
We aren't. To me, I told her what to put on the cards, and to me, writing and editing are the same. They are the collaborative thing. There's not going to be a card that says the editing. This part is me writing, Mary giving me feedback, me rewriting, Mary giving me feedback, us having aha moments, which we're going to discuss in a moment. But to me, the collaborative, and I sit in both chairs. I edit and I write, and I so believe in the editor-writer relationship when it's good, and I've had bad, really bad, but when it's good, it's really, neither one of you could do it alone. Neither one of you could make it as good as what you can do together. And it can be so fun that's why I do this. I don't want to sit alone in my room writing. I like that. In addition to reporting and going out and having people tell me their stories, which I love the reporting part of it, the writing where you're trying to come to something and you have somebody with you doing it. There's nothing better.
It's really, I think, one of the biggest jobs of an editor is to help a writer figure out when it's time to write. Because a writer will like nothing more than procrastinating and keep on digging in that hole to keep on, I need one more document that I probably have to drive somewhere really far to get that's going to cost $3,000. And do you really need that document? I think it may be time to face the blank page. And on the terror scale, the blank page with your little blinking cursor ranks like astronomically high. I've looked at that screen. I've been married to a writer for 18 years. I've seen him do the laundry and whatever he can to possibly not face that screen.
I edit Mary's husband on occasion, and he's good. He's a good procrastinator.
He's the best.
So he'll say, so this week I'm going to spend transcribing tape. And I'm like, no, you're not. You're not using all that good energy. You're doing the worst chore in the world. You've got it. You know what's in there. We can go in and get the quotes later. Just start writing. Well, I think I better transcribe those 75 hours of tape. I'm like, no, don't do that. Don't.
Yeah.
I know you can say that you're working while you're doing that, and it's very honorable, but don't do that. Use that energy, that fresh excitement that you're going to kill by transcribing, by writing.
Yeah. So it's your job to know when to pull them out of the hole.
So this is what my hole looks like. There's a bulletin board over there. This is my dining room table, which no food gets eaten at for most of the year, which is why we eat at we eat in the coffee table because of this.
It's a very big table, too.
It's a very large table, yes. It has leaves that I put on the end. It goes on and on. So the lead. Jeff and I were talking about this. Sometimes you think and you think and you think about what your story is, and you are afraid of the blank page, and so you figure out what definitely is the lead. I mean, you've decided it says everything about everything, and it's so your lead. And so many times, that isn't the case. What Jeff and I were talking about, that's never wasted time, you realize later, but you're heartbroken when you discover that it is not actually your lead. So because B was the central character to me, and I loved also that there was a woman at the heart of a Mafia story. You never get that. What? And she was a really close confidant of Bugsy Siegel? Really? Huh? And she was this really brassy lady, and it was a real character. So B had to be my lead. Like, she had to be my lead. And I had her alive on that tape. So I had fresh quotes and I could describe her. She had a floral house dress, blah, 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 blah. So I led off with B, and I really loved it. And then I turned in, everyone remembers how long theirs were. I don't remember, I blotted it out how long it was, but it was long. It's like 10,000 words or something.
It was longer than that.
Yeah, it was really long. Because I had a lot to say. And I turned it in, and I had the moment everyone describes of waiting for Mary to love it, because I really, really wanted Mary to love it. So then what happened, Mary?
So, leading with a description of found video footage from 20 years ago of someone no one has ever heard of required a lot of heavy lifting to explain to the reader, where am I and who is this person and why are you describing footage? And if it's footage, then that doesn't sound very exclusive. But Amy had a great get. Amy had her son, who was dying, who was an incredible source, who we can obviously step back and talk about this, but who actually is saying, I've got a secret, and I've got a family secret that's even bigger than the family secret you thought I had before. And you want to leave them hanging, always, I think, with your lead. Like you want, Jeff and Eric talked about this. Like it was the equivalent to me of our smoking gun, right? I mean, it was the way that I felt we were going to grab readers. On the terror scale for writers, right, the blank page is really high. On the terror scale for editors, I would say telling writers news they don't want to hear is equally as high. And I think an editor spends a lot of time trying to figure out how exactly am I going to be able to say this so it sounds incredibly supportive, but it basically is saying, go back and try it again.
Right.
And that's not a fun place to be. But I think that a great editor-writer relationship is a very sympathetic one, right? I sympathize enormously with writers. I write myself. I'm married to a writer, as I said. I know the whole routine with these guys. And I really sympathize with them. But I don't romanticize that relationship. And that's not to say that I don't love my writers, but I don't romanticize this whole notion of everything you say is beautiful and you should have 20,000 words for everything that you say, because that's a disservice to them. You're there to edit them. That's like the 4 main letters in your job title. And that's a really hard thing to break to someone, but if you trust your editor, you go that way. And if it didn't work, if her new lead didn't work, I'm a big girl, I would say, you know what, I was wrong. And I've said, like, this is still not working, let's do it again. I've rewritten leads on my own stories 5 times. Because I almost always know where a story's going to end. As a writer, and almost always when I'm working with an editor, we almost always know where that story's going to end. Ending's really easy, for whatever reason, for me. The beginnings are much harder.
Well, part of what helped me, I really was bummed out when Mary told me this. And I didn't think she was right at first. I was like, well, it's B. It's about the story about B, so I don't really know why you want me to start with this other guy, who actually is not very articulate, actually, in the end. I mean, he is my source, but he's not a very good storyteller, so I don't really have any really great quotes from him. And she happens to say that she has a big story to tell and she's going to die, and she's already dead. So I had a bunch of reasons why Mary was wrong, but but I also remember, I've had this happen on a couple of stories of mine where I knew what the story was about, but actually that scene was better in the 3rd section. Like that lead that I wrote, that I spent weeks on practically, or probably over time, weeks, did sum up all the themes in the story, but it was too much to get into all those themes in the lead. The lead, you need to hook the person. That's why you start with the gun and the LGBT in Russia. And Jim Nelson, the editor-in-chief of GQ, has done that for me with another story where I was determined to lead off with something, and he was like, no, you have to start with the murder. I thought it was too obvious. Well, it's obvious because it's the thing that people are most interested in. Don't fight it. The other thing that proved it to me was that I did have to do a lot of kind of complicated excavation and bending over backwards after the scene of B to explain to you why you were looking at something that was shot in 1993. Like, why are we in 1993? Well, because these videographers shot this footage. That has nothing to do with anything. So I was struggling with getting out of the lead. So I was like, okay, you're right. So the lead changed completely, and it was the right thing. The other thing that was happening was that we kind of knew from the get-go that we were not going to be able to solve it definitively, despite my pitch. everybody was dead. You know, everybody was dead. I was going to the Beverly Hills Police Department. They were shutting me down. They wouldn't talk about it.
In a most intriguing way, I
In a
felt.
most intriguing way, because they had told me that if I just provided the name, they would tell me whether he was a suspect. And the minute I did it, they suddenly said, you know what, actually, we can't talk to you anymore. So it kind of was like, hey, are we onto something? Or are you just overworked? And I don't know. So as I was writing, Mary is a huge fan of this book, L.A. Noire, and she said, why don't you call him? Just call him and talk to him about how he does this. And it was sort of an unusual source idea, but I ended up quoting him in the story because he talked in a way about the very nature of what we were doing, which is recreating the past. And that there was, he said, it may sound weird or sacrilegious, but history is an act of imagining. It's not just an act of nailing down all the facts, which of course you're going to do to the best of your ability. I'm not saying make it up. But in order to get to those facts, you have to imagine what might have happened. And that I find actually, even when you're not doing something that's 70 years old, as you're reporting a story on Katy Perry or Justin Timberlake, before you get into that interview, you're imagining how it's going to go down, or you're imagining what his issues are so that you're prepared. There's a lot of that kind of, it doesn't mean you put anything fictional in the piece, but you imagine how it might happen, or how something that happened to them might have happened. So that was actually really inspiring, and it allowed us to talk about sort of our worries.
And it also is, I can't tell you how many pieces I've read, read first drafts on from writers. Amy's piece was not one of these, other than him not being in it, which was an idea late in the game, where writers don't talk to other people. Or, I always try to talk with them during the writing process to make sure that they are fanning out, to have that outside voice, even if it's not in the actual article. That outside voice can just be so helpful in making you rethink the way you've thought of something, or there'll be a nugget of something. Like, your list of people you've talked to should be so much longer than the list of people who actually appear in the piece, because you really have got to have that kind of breadth and use people. People have information, use them.
Well, and I actually, when I called him, I didn't think he was going to be in the piece, but then he was so philosophical and kind of mystical and talk about sort of Yoda-like that I was like, okay, that's actually part of the story.
Okay.
One of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this story, other than the fact that it's the most recent thing we've done together, is the following part of this, because it so illustrates to me how an editor can really help you with your structure, even as you're writing. You might not be able to read this, but I'll tell you.
I can't read the whole thing.
And I won't read the whole thing. The first time I sat down with Robbie in his apartment in Pacific Palisades, we were sitting at his dining room table, and his wife, Renee, was sort of puttering around, and he was telling me the story of everything that he'd been told. And I could see the front door from where I was sitting, and at one point the front door opened, just sort of a foot. But I was sort of zeroing in on Robbie, who was kind of a difficult interview, and I saw Renee get up, and she went over to the door, and she opened it, and she looked out, and then she closed it, and she came back, and she said something to Robbie that I didn't even really listen to. The next time I was there, I had these pictures from the Paradise of B that they'd never seen before. So he'd never seen his mother at 17. And I was like, I was on this, I was Googling, and I found these pictures, and I like a tingle went up my spine. Like it was, I felt like almost like B wants us to do the story. And Renee said, oh, well, she does. You remember when you were here last time? I was like, yeah. She said, well, that was B coming in the door. I was like, what? She said, I said that to Robbie. I went back and listened to the tape. She said, your mother is here. But I wasn't listening to her. So I came home, and much like everyone's talking about sending dispatches to whatever time this was, I sent an email to Mary that says, the Moose story gets supernatural. and I told her the whole story and blah, blah, blah. I transcribed it. It's like, I totally believe in mediums. I live my life like that, blah, blah, blah. Renee, she's channeling you. I believe she brought you here, blah, 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 blah. And Mary responds, that is yum times. Okay, that is why I love her right there. All this other stuff. Okay, that is yum times. So I write the first draft, and I have this scene in it where, I even include, and then I go back and I listen to the tape, and she said, And I can't remember how I spun out of it, but when Mary read it in the first draft, she felt like it sounded too woo-woo, like I believe in ghosts and stuff.
And you came back to it a few times during the course
Well,
of the
because there was
piece.
this other moment in the story where Bugsy told B about you walk through a door. So the door to me had become this thing, like there was a door opening, but I hadn't totally figured out what Mary then figured out. But so she told me to take that out because it was like you're going to lose total credibility with your reader. Like suddenly you're like somebody who believes in ghosts. They're trying to believe that you've nailed down all these facts, and now you're like woo woo, and you're like, well, I don't know. I think she did it. You know, the ghost told me. So she's like, that needs to come out. And I was like, no, that can't come out. So second draft, I rewrote it to be a little less woo woo, but it was still in there. Like she told me to take it out. I just kept it in. So then what happened?
This story was jumping all over time. I know we don't have that much time, so I'll try to be fast. And other people have mentioned how difficult it can be to take a story. I mean, it was really, we had Las Vegas in the 40s and New York in the 20s and their lives in LA in the 70s and Robbie now, and when she died, and Moose, it was just like, it was a lot of jumping. And I think that there can be a tendency for insecure writers, and not just insecure writers, but for writers to try too hard with flourishes, right? To try too hard with conceits. I think that maybe we'll see a movement for people to stop doing a lot of that because but at the same time, there's times when you need some kind of a conceit that can kind of help, I think, the reader work through what's happening in the story when it is moving through time. And I always look when I'm paring down a story, especially for what are those things. A great lesson I was once taught is when you do have a 20,000 word long story and you're trying to figure out what to keep, read the whole thing with a highlighter and highlight what you absolutely can't lose. And I did that on a story I turned in once that was 18,000 words long, and I ended up with 7,000 words that I absolutely could not lose. Which is not to say that the other 11,000 words were superfluous, of course. But I felt with this story that I saw this theme, as Amy alluded to, that like she would have these doors open for her, and then these doors would close on her, like these leads that would go somewhere and that would stop. And there was this kind of conceit that we could take through the piece that would, again, it's a noir mystery, and it also felt like in keeping with like a Chandler, Dashiell Hammett kind of James Cain, like then the door opens and then the door closes. And then how could we use that as a way to move readers through the story of actually what's happening to Amy without inserting Amy so much? Because when I had to cut down the story from the original, I cut out a lot of Amy.
Well, I'm very fascinating, but. So she comes back really excited. She goes, okay, the door, it's working now. I see, I get it. And I'm like, yeah. She goes, it's the whole structure. Like we're gonna use it for every, the door's gonna open, the door's gonna close, and I was like, wow, yeah. So again, that was a major part of the writing. It was Mary that did it. I fought her to push something I knew was there. To me, this is a perfect example of the collaboration. Like, I knew something was there. It kept coming up, and I was gonna put it in, but I hadn't gone so far as to actually think of it structurally. I just wanted to put it in as an anecdote. So we will finish with this. This went to, everyone's talking about shipping, sending the magazine to the printer. So we were supposed to ship on Friday, we're always late. So it was Saturday. And Saturday morning.
Mostly because of facts. Facts in the lawyer.
Mostly because of facts. It was a
fair.
complicated fact-checking process, as you might imagine. People were dead, all of them.
They don't call you back when they're dead, so it's kind of a problem.
Mary was getting in a car to go to an airport, and she called me on Saturday morning.
I had taken the proof home Friday night because I knew we had that little window, which we don't normally have.
And Ed, her husband, so we all know each other really well. She often asks Ed to do a read on on anything, because he's a great reader. And the original end of the story is Robbie, and it originally said, he opened the door. Maybe without meaning to, an unwitting Robbie led me to the realization too before dying himself. He opened the door, and then he closed it. That's what it said, and it was about to ship. And Ed said, so Mary's on the phone, she goes, okay, so I'm on the way to the airport, and so I had to read the story, and he had a really interesting point about the end. I was like, what? The door's not closed. Like, the door's still open. He opened it, the case is still open. He opened the door, and it's still open. isn't that the kicker? And I was like, yeah, so literally we changed the last line of the story, like as it was being sent.
Teleported to the printer, yeah.
So.
Which is to say that, remember that all of your words are precious, but you should have friends. I don't remember who said that here today.
Yes, absolutely, I've so resonated with that.
Who can be there to help you out.
Work with
Or
who you
husbands.
like. Work with who you like to the extent that you can, and always, whenever you find that reader, whoever it is, it may be one of your friends here, it's an editor you used to work with, but you're now at a different place, always seek those people out. I mean, somebody said hold them close, and that is so true. So we're ready for questions.
Questions?
So Amy, for this reporting process, obviously a very long process, very in-depth, kind of like chasing ghosts, obviously, so everyone was dead, or pretty much everyone was dead. What, in a reporting process that was so rife with setbacks and things to overcome, what was the most difficult part and the most rewarding part of that experience?
Well, interestingly, I haven't even talked about this interview, but I did reach one of Moose's relatives, and it was Moose's brother's son. So it was Moose's nephew. And he's the only member of Moose's family, so the accused murderer's family, that I reached. And that was one of those things that if he had just said, what do you mean you're going to accuse one of my family members of murder? That wouldn't have been as good as what ended up happening. I mean, after I interviewed Steve Panza, is what he goes by, I was high. I couldn't sleep. I interviewed him at 9 o'clock at night. I couldn't sleep until 2 in the morning because he'd been such a great interview. First of all, he talked like a normal person, which I loved. He had all these memories of Bee and Moose, and he totally bought that this could have happened. His father had told him at one point that there was a dark secret in their family, and he was going to tell it to him, but of course, he hadn't ever told him. It would have been better if I'd heard the story, but still he was not disbelieving of that. So weirdly, that was a little reporting moment that was just, I'd tracked him down, I'd gotten him, he was a great interview. He said something like, she was dynamite, she was like dynamite.
Dynamite in small package.
Yeah, she was dynamite in a small package. I was like, that's say that again, Woo, it's getting hot in here, So there were moments and that's just reporting, wonderful reporting moments. I mean, where you get somebody who's just a great storyteller.
Yum times.
That's yum times is what that is. That is the definition of yum times. I was scared of getting it wrong. That was the main bummer.
And because this is such a classic LA story. I mean, this is really the greatest, next to Jimmy Hoffa, the greatest unsolved mob mystery, right, in America. And in LA, next to the Black Dahlia murder, the crime that everyone knows about. So we were playing with fire a little bit.
And also, people come forward every 2 years with a new solution. Right. So it's not like no one has ever speculated. And in the story, we mention a couple, like Nick Pileggi has his theory, and someone else had that. The LA Noir guy has his theory. Everybody has a theory, so it's not like no one's thought about this before. And there are some real experts in mob history who, so that was the part that was kind of tense for me, that we needed to we needed to do our due diligence and not screw it up.
Has anybody challenged you about any of the facts?
Interestingly.
No. Well, Renee, you'll be glad to know, Robbie's widow, because Robbie died at the end of my reporting, wanted us all to know that Robbie loves it because she's talked to him, because
He opened the door.
Yep. He said it was fantastic, so that was a relief to me. I haven't heard from Bee, but
or maybe you have.
Or maybe I have. She's watching over me.
Here.
She could be.
Nobody. One of the guys with a competing theory who had read about and researched, he got in touch and wanted to tell me how his theory is better, which is fine.
But no one's
we
told
never
us
heard
it's
anything.
wrong.
Yeah, we never heard anything from the Beverly Hills Police Department, who we kind of call out for. I explain how one guy promised me, and then another guy promised me, and then when I did all the things and jumped through all their hoops, then they reneged, and we were like, okay, reader, you be the judge. Yeah. But we never heard from them, so nobody challenged it.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. And I just had a curious question about how you kind of psyched yourself up or organized your thoughts before going to Ancestry.com and kind of typing in the first word.
Well, that wasn't his biggest psych. When I'm sitting outside the one-armed man's house, that's when I have to psych myself up. And I've never had a one-armed man, but I've had the door. I've door knocked people, and it's always a little. You got to eat your Wheaties that morning, you know. It more felt like going down, as everybody's used the analogy, rabbit hole. Like, whoa, like I'm falling, there's deep darkness underneath and I'm not sure what. Like, you didn't know where you were headed. Mary's actually really good at Ancestry because she does a lot of stuff with genealogy. And I'd never really been on those sites before. I'd never gotten into my own history that way. So actually, I was kind of grateful. There's so much online now. I mean, like, crazy. I found like juvenile detention records of Moose's brother that showed me that in when he was 15, blah, 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 like more information than anyone needed. I found census records from when they were little and where their address was. The house is still standing right next to Chavez Ravine, which is where Dodger Stadium is. So I know all this stuff that didn't make the story, but.
It's a very exciting feeling as a writer or as an editor of the story working with a writer when they do make those discoveries. I mean, that's part of the reason why I got into this business. I think it's part of the reason why a lot of writers do, and it's probably a reason why I know 3 freelance writers who ended up becoming private detectives. We're diggers, you know, we're diggers by nature, and we're just naturally curious, and when you dig and you unearth a stone.
I just had an experience, not on this story, but Conrad Hilton, Paris Hilton's little brother, had a big sort of tantrum on an airplane that happened to be going from London to Los Angeles for 10 hours, so he terrorized this airplane. And it became public because the FBI looked into it and they filed a complaint. And at GQ, we decided we were going to do oral history of the flight. Meaning I was going to find as many people who were on the flight, and I was going to talk to them all, and I was going to intersplice them, which we've done on a couple of occasions. I did it with a Dave Chappelle live act, The Comedy Cellar. It's really a fun way to tell a story. So it would be none of my words. It would just be spliced together quotes. Problem was, the complaint had a bunch of people quoted really colorfully, but they were only identified by their initials. So how was I going to find them? Of course, I called the FBI agent, hoping he would slip it to me. No, he wasn't going to do that. The U.S. attorney, yeah, thanks. Good luck to you. We really hope you get this story because it's really great, but good luck. No. So, and most of the people in the complaint were British Airways employees who, of course, would be fired if they talked about it. So that was a problem. But one of the passengers, PM, by her initials, was described as a life coach and British broadcaster who lived in Los Angeles. So with those 2 bits of information, I went onto Yelp and I typed in life coach Los Angeles. And then while I was at LA Magazine doing something else with my left hand, I just kept clicking through pages and pages and pages. And you would imagine in Los Angeles, lots of life coaches. We need all the help we can get.
You may have invented the life coach.
Yes. And I'm like, and the whole time I'm doing it, I'm like, Amy, this is so stupid. It's never gonna, why do we do this? Bing. PM. Patricia Mitchell, life coach. Really? Okay. Click on her website. I'm a British broadcaster. It's her. And here's my email address. So I email her and I'm like, this is kind of a weird, I'm emailing for a weird reason. Were you by any chance on flight 1542 on July 14th of last year when you blah, 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 blah? Yep, that's me. She just called me. Hi, it's Patricia Mitchell. This woman, again, I was just referencing real people who talk as opposed to famous people who talk. Not that
famous people who don't talk.
Or famous people who don't talk, and I've had my share of those as well. This woman was like wonderful. She was a funny storyteller. She spoke in Britishisms, which were fantastic. He was effing and blinding. I was like, what? And that's cursing in British talk. But then she got really philosophical about Conrad Hilton, this little punk, and she kept pulling in all these cultural references, and she talked about how weirdly on the plane to England, they'd been talking about who famous people who were good on planes and bad, and Mick Jagger's supposed to be really polite, and da-da-da-da. She told the whole story. This one woman told the whole story, and then at the end, she talked about her favorite movie was Captain's Courageous with Spencer Tracy, and it's all, have you ever seen it? Oh my God, it makes me cry. So he's like on a piece of fisherman, he's Portuguese, and this little boy falls in the water, and he's rich, and he's horrible, and he's badly behaved, but he pulls him out of the water, and then he teaches him how to be a man, and it's like this moment of redemption at the end of the story. And it's all just Patricia talking. Again, it was exciting to find her, but then that she was so great. We didn't need British Airways. We didn't need anybody else. Patricia did the whole job. So we put it up online. We were like, bam. And
it was substantiated by the report, though, right?
Yes, so I didn't do an oral history because I only had I only had one person. So I interspersed it with details from the complaint. It was like an annotated interview. But that's the reporting part of this is so fun. When you get, and not just when you get that the person answers the door or the phone, but when they tell you something you really don't know. They share their insights with you. It's so satisfying. And somebody else said this earlier, and I just want to reiterate it. One of the Evans said it. One of the things, and actually Chris Jones told me to say this, so I should say it. One of the reasons I became a journalist.
That's not necessarily the best.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's not going to involve my bodily functions. But I became a journalist when I was in college. I decided to try it. I had moved around a lot as a kid. I was really shy. I'd grown 6 inches in 1 year and was like a total stork. And I got to college and I was uncomfortable with myself, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I got into somehow trying journalism, and I found that if I had the mandate of being given an assignment, it made me brave. Like suddenly I wasn't me, just dorky me going to ask a question or try to be impressive. I was there with a job to do, and I could be bolder. And I like that feeling. I think that's totally why I ended up doing this for a living. It was the first time I'd have that feeling. And the thing I found when I got over that hump was that people love to talk about themselves. They're flattered. And like important people, Nobel Prize winning economists and people that you would think would be busy, and not just forget famous people, but anybody, their spouses are sick of hearing about them. But you're coming in, you're like, I read your 1978 paper about blah, 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 blah. And they're like, really? And people like to talk. And if you can really listen, like Chris said, and really hear them and then respond, and then they'll tell you a huge amount, not just about the thing you're interviewing them about necessarily, but about life. And you get to hear it. You get to know, you get to go into worlds you've never been in before, and you get to hear their insights that you would never have. That is just thrilling. And
one more question.
Yep.
Sorry. Getting back to the story, you mentioned this TV producer who didn't go through with the B story in the 90s because Robbie told him that the mob could retaliate, and it was already like 40-something years after the murder. So was it your concern in any way? Or?
Well, it's interesting. There's something in the news about this, which I blogged a little bit about on lamag.com. So the Jinx on HBO right now, the guy has just admitted, well, theoretically has admitted, oh, sorry.
If you listen to the Jinx, just hold your ears for a second.
Okay. There's one of the murders that he potentially did is a woman in LA named Susan Berman, who was the daughter of Davy Berman, who was one of Bugsy's cohorts. So Robbie said to me, one of the reasons I've been reluctant to tell this story is because Susan Berman was executed in her house in Beechwood Canyon, and I think the Mafia did it. So there was still fear. Now, it turns out perhaps the Mafia didn't do it. But there was still fear that the Mafia lives on and that they would. So I didn't have that fear for some reason, but I didn't. It's been so long, everybody's gone. But I was aware of it, and I did interview the guy who stood down and didn't end up following through with that And he still was, he talked about feeling afraid. So.
Well, thank you. Stay around. We are about to do our last session too.